We think we know the shape of disaster. We see it in films, in headlines, in stories told with a comfortable distance. We imagine it as a single, explosive moment, a crash, a boom, a sudden cataclysm from which heroes rise and a clear path to rebuilding emerges. We have been conditioned to see history's great tragedies as contained events, chapters in a book we can close when the story becomes too grim. But this is a profound and dangerous misconception. True calamity is not a thunderclap, it is a creeping sickness. It is not an event, but a process. It is a slow, methodical dissolution of everything you trust, everything you believe to be solid and enduring. It is the air you breathe turning to poison, the hand of a loved one becoming a source of terror, the very foundations of your world dissolving like sand in a relentless tide. You are not ready for what this story truly is. You believe you can stand apart from it, an observer shielded by centuries. But the forces that undid the world then are the same forces that lie dormant in our world now: fear, denial, the fragility of order, and the terrifying indifference of nature. This is not a story about them. It is a story about us, reflected in a dark, medieval mirror. So, for this, I need you to be present. Not as a spectator, but as a witness. Put the world away. Let the distractions of the modern age fall silent. The screen you are looking at is a window, and we are about to step through it. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. The city, in the year of our Lord 1347, was a dream of stone and gold, a testament to the defiant ambition of humanity. Florence. La Bella. She sat nestled in the cradle of the Arno River, her cup of blessings overflowing, her towers scratching at the Tuscan sky like the proud fingers of God. She was not merely a city, she was an argument. An argument that commerce could be a form of prayer, that beauty was a currency as vital as the golden florin, and that man, through intellect and will, could forge a paradise on earth. Her wealth was legendary, spun from the wool of English sheep and the intricate mathematics of banking. The great houses, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaioli, were not just families, they were empires, their financial tentacles reaching from London to Constantinople, holding kings and popes in their debt. This river of gold fed a ravenous appetite for glory. It commissioned Giotto to paint the heavens on chapel walls, turning plaster into divine narrative. It was raising, stone by agonizing stone, the colossal skeleton of a new cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, a structure so audacious it would not be completed for another century, a statement of faith in a future Florence believed it owned. The streets hummed with a vibrant, chaotic energy. They were narrow, winding, and dark, overhung with wooden balconies, but they were alive. The clatter of the weaver's loom, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the cry of the street vendor, the murmur of Latin from the university, the conspiratorial whisper of merchants in the loggias, it was the symphony of a civilization at its absolute zenith. The air itself, though thick with the smells of leather, spices, wood smoke, and the ever-present press of humanity, seemed charged with possibility. Power was a game played with ruthless elegance. Guilds controlled every facet of life, from the price of bread to the training of an artist. The Signoria, the city's ruling council, governed from the imposing Palazzo Vecchio, its crenellated tower a constant reminder of civic authority. Justice, swift and often brutal, was dispensed in the Bargello. Religion was the city's very spine. Processions of penitents and jubilant Saints' Day festivals wound through the piazze. The Dominican friars of Santa Maria Novella and the Franciscans of Santa Croce vied for the souls of the populace, their grand churches standing as rival fortresses of faith. Life was governed by the tolling of bells, each one with a name and a voice, marking the hours for prayer, for work, for curfew. It was a society of rigid hierarchies, yet one that possessed a dynamic, churning heart. A talented artisan could rise. A clever merchant could become a magnate. The promise of Florence was the promise of ascent. And so they lived, the Florentines of the mid-14th century, encased in the splendid certainty of their world. They were brilliant, pious, quarrelsome, and proud. They saw their city not just as their home, but as the new Rome, the center of the civilized world, blessed by God and favored by fortune. They believed in the sanctity of their walls, the strength of their banks, the genius of their artists, and the unwavering order of their universe. They were, in their own eyes, inviolable. But far away, beyond the reach of their ledgers and the scope of their maps, a different kind of power was gathering. It was a power that did not care for gold, or art, or prayer. It was an ancient, biological force, stirring from a long slumber in the vast, arid heart of a continent they knew only through rumor and trade. It was a whispering wind from the east, and it had begun its long, patient journey. It moved without malice, without intent, as indifferent as gravity. And it was coming for the golden city on the Arno, to test the strength of its walls, the value of its florins, and the limits of its faith. The dream of Florence was about to end, and the city would awaken into a nightmare from which it could never truly recover. The stage was set, the actors blissfully unaware, and the air, so full of promise, held the first, imperceptible scent of decay. The antagonist of this story is not a person. It has no consciousness, no strategy, no malice. Its kingdom is the invisible world, its soldiers are microscopic, and its chariot is the humble flea. The journey of Yersinia pestis from its quiet endemic reservoir to the heart of Europe is a story of globalization in a world that did not yet have the word for it. For centuries, the bacterium lay dormant in the blood of the black rat and its wilder cousin, the marmot, across the vast, dry steppes of Central Asia. It was a local problem, a cyclical affliction for nomadic tribes, a strange and deadly fever that would flare up and then vanish back into the immense, uncaring landscape. It was a secret kept by the earth itself. But the world was shrinking. The Mongol Empire, in its magnificent and brutal expansion, had pacified the continent, creating a vast, contiguous landmass under a single rule. The old, perilous caravan routes became the arteries of a new global network, the Silk Road. Along this sprawling web of commerce, goods flowed as never before, silk, spices, porcelain, and ideas from the east traveled westward, while wool, silver, and ambitions from the west traveled east. No one saw the stowaway. No one could. Hidden in the fur of the black rats that scurried through the holds of caravanserais, nestled in the folds of textiles and the dusty bottoms of grain sacks, the fleas carrying the pestilence began their westward migration. They were passengers on the great engine of human enterprise. The bacterium was a patient traveler. It moved at the speed of a loaded camel, the pace of a merchant's barge. From the Gansu corridor, through Samarkand and Tabriz, it crept. With every stop, it established a new colony. A few rats would scurry ashore, finding new homes in the granaries and thatched roofs of a trading post. A few infected fleas would find new hosts. A small, localized outbreak might occur, a village suddenly silenced, its fate a mystery to those who passed by weeks later. These were the first tremors, ignored and unrecorded, whispers lost in the immense distances of the medieval world. The journey was not a straight line but a slow, insidious bloom, a dark flower opening petal by petal across the map. The tipping point, the moment the whisper became a scream, occurred at the edge of the Black Sea, in the thriving Genoese trading colony of Kaffa in the Crimea. In 1346, the city was under siege by the armies of the Golden Horde, led by Yani Beg. The siege was long and brutal, a stalemate of stone walls against relentless numbers. Then, the besieging Mongol army began to fall ill. A mysterious sickness swept through their camps, a foe more deadly than any Genoese crossbowman. Soldiers collapsed with raging fevers, their bodies erupting in dark, swollen buboes in the groin and armpits. Death was swift and agonizing. Yani Beg, his army disintegrating, made a decision of profound and terrible ingenuity, an act that would become one of history's most infamous examples of biological warfare. He ordered the corpses of his plague-dead soldiers to be loaded onto catapults. The decaying bodies, bundles of contagion, were hurled over the high walls and into the besieged city. The defenders of Kaffa watched in horror as the grotesque projectiles arced through the sky, landing with a sickening thud in their streets and squares. At first, it was a psychological assault, a desecration. The Genoese, disgusted, threw the bodies into the sea. But it was too late. The damage was not in the impact, but in the invisible aerosol of disease, in the fleas that abandoned the cooling corpses for new, warm-blooded hosts. Rats, thriving in the besieged city, became vectors. Soon, the people of Kaffa began to sicken. The same fever, the same delirium, the same black swellings. The city had become a trap. The Genoese merchants, realizing the siege was lost not to the Mongols but to this new horror, did the only thing they could. They fled. In the autumn of 1347, a small fleet of Genoese galleys slipped out of the harbor of Kaffa, their holds filled with silks, spices, and a handful of desperate, dying men. They were racing for home, for the familiar shores of Italy, believing they were escaping death. They were, in fact, its couriers. As the ships sailed west across the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus, and into the sun-drenched Mediterranean, the plague worked its way through the crews. Men who had set the sails in the Aegean Sea were dead and thrown overboard by the time the ship passed Crete. The galleys became floating coffins, ghost ships crewed by the doomed, their mission no longer commerce, but the delivery of a pestilence that would unravel the known world. The wind that filled their sails was the same wind that would soon blow through the empty streets of Florence, carrying not the scent of the sea, but the stench of apocalypse. The disease had crossed its final barrier. It had taken to the sea, the superhighway of the medieval world, and now all of Christendom, with its bustling ports, its interconnected cities, and its profound ignorance of bacteriology, lay open and defenseless before it. The arrival was deceptively quiet. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys, the same ships that had fled the charnel house of Kaffa, limped into the bustling harbor of Messina, Sicily. To the harbor masters and merchants gathered on the docks, something was immediately, horribly wrong. These were not the triumphant ships of commerce they were used to seeing. There was an unnatural silence aboard them. No sailors lined the rails, eager for shore leave. The sails were sloppily furled. As the first galley was tied to the quay, the truth was revealed. The local officials who boarded were met with a scene from hell. The decks were littered with the dead and dying. The few sailors still able to stand were spectral figures, racked with fever, their speech nonsensical, their bodies marked with the terrifying black swellings that oozed a dark fluid. They were, as one chronicler wrote, so stricken in the flesh that they bore the marks of death upon them. Panic erupted. The authorities of Messina, acting with a desperate, instinctual wisdom, immediately ordered the ghost ships out of their harbor. But the act was as futile as trying to command the tide to retreat. The ships had been moored for days. Rats, the ubiquitous, unseen passengers of every medieval vessel, had already scurried down the mooring ropes and vanished into the warrens of the port city. Fleas, starved for a new host as their shipboard victims cooled, had already found new purchase on the dockworkers and the curious onlookers. The galleys were expelled, sent back to sea to drift and spread their contagion to other ports, but they had already planted the seed. Within days, the first citizens of Messina began to fall ill. The sickness was unlike anything they had ever known. It began with a shivering fever, headaches, and a profound weariness. Then came the sign, the harbinger of a swift and almost certain death, the gavacciolo. A hard, painful swelling, appearing in the groin, the armpit, or on the neck. The bubo. It grew with terrifying speed, from the size of a hazelnut to that of an apple. Black spots, the tokens, would then bloom across the skin, caused by internal hemorrhaging. The victim's mind would cloud with delirium, their body racked with pain, until death brought a merciful end, usually within 3 to 5 days. The people of Messina, overcome with terror, turned on the afflicted, driving them from their homes. The healthy fled into the countryside, inadvertently carrying the disease with them, seeding it throughout the Sicilian interior. From Sicily, the plague leaped to the mainland. The expelled Genoese ships or other merchant vessels unknowingly contaminated, docked in Genoa and Venice in the north, and in Pisa, the great maritime rival of Florence. Each port of call became a new epicenter. Venice, with its dense population and labyrinthine canals, became a death trap. Pisa, the gateway to Tuscany, received the pestilence in the winter of 1347. The path to Florence was now open. Throughout that winter and into the spring of 1348, the news that traveled up the trade routes was not of profits and politics, but of a creeping, inexplicable doom. Rumors, exaggerated and confused, reached the Florentines. They spoke of a pestilence that came from the air, of a swift and terrible judgment from God. Florence, ever proud and pragmatic, listened with a mixture of fear and skepticism. They were not a superstitious port town, they were the center of the world, protected by their wealth, their intellect, and their faith. The Signoria, the city's government, took what seemed to be sensible precautions, the most advanced public health measures of the age. They appointed a special committee of 8 citizens to manage the crisis. They barred entry to travelers from Pisa and Genoa. They forbade the importation of potentially contaminated textiles. They organized deep cleanings of the city, ordering refuse to be cleared from the streets. They held massive public processions and prayers, begging for divine mercy. They believed they could legislate the plague away, that they could hold it at bay with civic orders and public piety. It was a rational response to an irrational foe. They were trying to build a dam of paper against a tidal wave. As the spring of 1348 blossomed, painting the Tuscan hills in vibrant greens and golds, a shadow fell over Florence. The plague had breached the walls. It did not arrive with a grand announcement or a formal declaration of war. It slipped in quietly, perhaps in a bundle of pisan cloth that evaded the inspectors, or in the fur of a rat that had hitched a ride on a grain cart. The enemy was inside the gates, and the Golden City, for all its pride and power, was utterly, horrifyingly vulnerable. The first cases were isolated, confusing. A wool carter in the Oltrarno district, a dyer by the river, a tanner in a crowded tenement. Doctors, relying on the ancient theories of Galen and Hippocrates, were baffled. They diagnosed it as a malignant fever, a humoral imbalance. They prescribed bloodletting, useless poultices, and dietary changes. But then the patients' families began to sicken. Then their neighbors. The pattern, terrifying and undeniable, began to emerge. The black swellings appeared. The delirium set in. The swift, inexorable march to the grave. The whispers of a distant plague from the east were now the screams of a neighbor in the street. The abstract fear had become a tangible, horrifying reality. Florence, the jewel of Europe, had begun to die. The first death is a tragedy. The 10th is a statistic. The 1000th is the background noise of a world coming apart. In the early spring of 1348, the sickness that had slithered into Florence began to assert its dominion, not with a sudden onslaught, but with a series of terrifying tremors that shook the city's very soul. The first pockets of infection appeared, predictably, in the poorer quarters. Along the banks of the Arno, where the dyers and tanners worked, and in the densely packed tenements of the Oltrarno, the plague found fertile ground. Here, families lived crowded into 1 or 2 rooms, sanitation was rudimentary, and the black rat, the plague's silent partner, was an unwelcome but constant companion. A child would develop a fever, and the mother would dismiss it as a common chill. An artisan would feel a painful lump in his groin and attribute it to a strain from his work. Denial was the first defense, a fragile shield against a horror the mind could not yet accept. But the shield shattered quickly. The fever would spike, the lump would swell into a monstrous, weeping bubo, and the tokens, the dark subcutaneous hemorrhages, would appear like a devil's fingerprints on the skin. Death, agonizing and swift, would follow. The horror was compounded by its intimacy. This was not a distant battle, but a war waged inside the home, on the family bed. The rituals of sickness and death, so central to medieval life, became impossible vectors of transmission. A wife tending her sick husband would breathe in the bacteria, now capable of pneumonic, person-to-person spread. A priest administering last rites would lean close to hear a final confession and seal his own fate. A son kissing his deceased mother goodbye would embrace his own death. The disease exploited love, turning piety and compassion into instruments of its own propagation. As the body count rose from dozens to hundreds, the city's response systems began to falter. The physicians, the learned men of the age, were powerless. Clad in their long robes, holding sponges soaked in vinegar and herbs to their noses to ward off the miasma, the corrupted air they believed caused the disease, they moved through the afflicted houses like bewildered priests of a forgotten cult. Their knowledge, based on the balance of the four humors, was useless against a bacteriological agent. They lanced the buboes, releasing a torrent of infected pus, a procedure that often hastened death and endangered the physician. They prescribed theriac, a complex and expensive compound of dozens of ingredients including viper's flesh, which did nothing. They advised the burning of aromatic woods, juniper, ash, vine, to purify the air, filling the city with a sweet, cloying smoke that mingled sickeningly with the growing stench of death. The failure of medicine was a profound psychological blow. If the most educated men, the masters of the physical world, were helpless, then who could offer salvation? The people turned to God. Churches were packed. The great bells of the city, from Giotto's campanile to the smaller parishes, tolled incessantly for Mass, for prayers, for the dead. Fervent, desperate processions wound through the streets, with citizens flagellating themselves, hoping their own blood could appease the divine wrath that was so clearly raining down upon them. But these gatherings, these desperate acts of collective faith, only served the plague's purpose. The crowds, pressed tightly together, breathing the same air, became incubators. People who entered a church seeking salvation left with a death sentence. The realization dawned with chilling slowness: the very act of seeking comfort was a source of danger. God, it seemed, was not listening. Or worse, he was the author of their suffering. This crisis of faith was mirrored by a crisis of civic order. The Signoria issued decree after decree. They attempted to establish quarantine, ordering afflicted houses to be boarded up, sealing the sick and the healthy inside together to perish. They tried to regulate the disposal of the dead. But the men tasked with enforcing these rules, the city guards and officials, were themselves sickening and dying. Authority was evaporating. The law, which had seemed as solid as the stone of the Palazzo Vecchio, was becoming a ghost. The streets, once a symbol of Florentine vitality, transformed. Shops were shuttered. The markets grew quiet. The normal, vibrant sounds of the city were replaced by a new, terrifying soundscape: the wailing from behind closed doors, the sudden shriek of a new victim, and the low, constant rumble of the death carts. Fear, a cold and greasy presence, became the new ruler of Florence. It was a rational fear. The enemy was invisible, the method of transmission a mystery. It could be in the air, on a coin passed from hand to hand, in the touch of a friend. Neighbors began to eye each other with suspicion. The city, which had been a community, was atomizing into a collection of terrified, isolated individuals. The first tremors had passed, and the great edifice of Florentine society was showing deep, irreparable cracks. The foundations of family, faith, law, and commerce, which had taken centuries to build, were beginning to crumble under the relentless, silent pressure of the pestilence. The nightmare was no longer at the gates, it was in the bedroom, in the church, in the piazza. And the worst was yet to come. The pestilence did not only corrupt the body, it dissolved the very mortar that held human society together. In the summer of 1348, as the plague reached its devastating peak in Florence, the city underwent a complete social and moral collapse. The intricate web of obligations, affections, and duties that constitutes a civilization came undone, thread by thread, until what was left was a terrifying vision of humanity reduced to its most primal instincts, survival and fear. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the horror firsthand and used it as the grim backdrop for his Decameron, described this disintegration with chilling precision. The breakdown began in the most sacred and fundamental unit of society, the family. Such was the terror that this pestilence bred in the hearts of men and women, he wrote, that brother forsook brother, uncle nephew, sister brother, and often wife her husband, most terribly of all, fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children, as though they did not belong to them. This was the ultimate violation of natural law, a world turned upside down. The home, the sanctuary, became a place of dread. The sight of a loved one sickening was no longer just a cause for grief, but a signal of mortal danger to oneself. The bonds of blood, which had defined identity, inheritance, and honor in Florentine society, proved shockingly brittle in the face of annihilation. People died alone, abandoned in their beds. Their final hours were not spent surrounded by weeping family, but in solitude, their cries for a sip of water going unanswered. With the family unit shattered, the broader community disintegrated. The laws of the city, both written and unwritten, became meaningless. The officials of the signoria and the lesser magistrates were either dead, ill, or had fled the city in terror. The ministers and executors of the laws, human and divine, Boccaccio observed, were all dead or sick or so short of help that they were unable to execute any office. As a result, everyone was free to do what was pleasing to him. Anarchy reigned. But it was not the anarchy of riot and rebellion, it was a quieter, more insidious anarchy of abandonment. There was no one to guard the city, no one to record deeds and wills, no one to adjudicate disputes. The dead lay in their houses for days, the stench of their decay the only announcement of their passing. Neighbors, who once would have rushed to help, now sealed their own doors, praying the corruption in the air would not seep through the cracks. The rituals that gave life meaning and structure vanished. Weddings ceased. Baptisms were performed hastily, if at all. The rites of death, so elaborate and important in medieval culture, were the first to be abandoned. There were no solemn funeral processions, no mourners in dark cloaks, no respectful vigils. There was simply not enough time, not enough healthy people, and too many dead. The dead were dragged from their houses and left in the doorways, so that in the mornings, the streets were lined with corpses. The bacchini, the corpse-bearers, became essential figures in this new, hellish landscape. These were men from the lowest rungs of society, often criminals offered pardons, who for high pay would collect the dead. They were coarse, brutal, and utterly desensitized. They would travel with carts, shouting, "Bring out your dead." They would enter homes, often looting what they could, and haul out the bodies, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time, piling them onto the carts like so much cordwood. They would then transport them not to the consecrated ground of the churchyards, which had filled up almost immediately, but to vast, deep trenches dug outside the city walls. These were the carni, the mass graves. Bodies were thrown in layer upon layer, with a thin sprinkling of earth between them, like lasagna, as one chronicler grimly noted. There was no prayer, no name, no stone. A person's life, their entire existence within the rich tapestry of Florence, was reduced to an anonymous layer in a pit. This collapse of order was not just civic, but spiritual. The clergy, who were supposed to be the shepherds of the flock, suffered catastrophic losses. They were on the front lines, visiting the sick, hearing confessions, and burying the dead. Their mortality rate was immense. As priests died, their roles were taken by less qualified, sometimes illiterate men, further eroding the church's authority. For the populace, the silence of God was deafening. The failure of prayer, of relics, of processions to halt the tide of death led to a deep, shearing crisis of faith. If the church could not protect them, if God would not intervene, then what was the point of piety? This spiritual void, combined with the collapse of law, created a moral vacuum, and humanity, in its desperation, rushed to fill it in myriad ways. The city had ceased to be a functioning society. It was now merely a geographical location, a collection of stone buildings inhabited by the dying and the terrified, each individual an island of fear. The social contract had been rendered null and void, not by revolution or war, but by a microscopic organism that had proven, decisively, that civilization was a fragile, contingent construction, easily unmade. Florence was no longer a city, it was a tomb in waiting. In the crucible of the plague, the Florentine character, once a complex alloy of piety, ambition, and civic pride, was smelted down into its raw elements. Faced with the near certainty of a meaningless death, the people of the city fractured into distinct psychological tribes, each pursuing a different strategy for navigating the apocalypse. These divergent paths revealed the profound depths of human fear, selfishness, faith, and despair. The first and most conspicuous group were the hedonists. Their philosophy was simple and brutal: life was short, death was inevitable, so why not drain the cup of pleasure to its dregs? Boccaccio paints a vivid picture of this faction, who maintained that to carouse and enjoy themselves and to go about singing and amusing themselves, satisfying every appetite they could, and to laugh and jest at whatever happened was the best medicine for such a evil. They threw off all restraint. They formed small groups and moved from one tavern to another, and then, finding the owners dead or fled, they took over the abandoned palaces of the wealthy. They drank the finest wines from the cellars, feasted on what food they could find, and gave themselves over to every form of debauchery. The concept of private property vanished for them. If a house was empty, it was theirs for the taking. Their laughter and song, echoing through the otherwise silent streets, was not a sound of joy but of hysteria, a desperate defiance hurled into the face of the void. They represented a complete rejection of the old moral order, a deliberate inversion of the values of thrift, piety, and moderation that had built Florence. They lived only for the present moment, because they truly believed there would be no tomorrow. Diametrically opposed to them were the ascetics. This group, equally convinced of the plague's finality, drew the opposite conclusion. They saw the pestilence not as a random biological event, but as a divine scourge, a punishment for humanity's sins. Their only hope for survival, both in this world and the next, was to appease God through extreme piety and isolation. They walled themselves up in their homes, alone or with a few like-minded individuals. They ate and drank in the greatest moderation, consuming only the plainest foods and a little wine. They would touch no one from the outside world, speak to no one, and refuse to even hear the news of the death and depravity in the streets. Their days were spent in prayer, contemplation, and fasting. They would sometimes gather at their windows to enjoy the scent of flowers and herbs, believing these pure fragrances could ward off the corrupted air. They sought to create a bubble of sanctity, a monastic cell in the midst of a city-sized hell. Theirs was a strategy of spiritual quarantine, a desperate gamble that God would spare the righteous, overlooking the sea of sin that surrounded them. Between these two extremes of indulgence and abstinence lay a third group, who attempted to walk a middle path. They did not flee or lock themselves away, nor did they give themselves to wild abandon. They believed in moderation. They moved freely about the city, but carried in their hands posies of fragrant flowers, or bunches of aromatic herbs, which they would frequently hold to their noses. Their logic was medical, or what passed for it at the time. They believed the disease was a miasma, a poison in the air, and that by breathing in these purer, sweeter smells, they could counteract the pestilential vapors. They lived more temperately than the hedonists, but more freely than the ascetics. They conversed with their neighbors, conducted what little business they could, and tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Yet, their strategy was as based on magical thinking as the others, a belief that a handful of rosemary could stand against a biological holocaust. Many of them, Boccaccio notes, sickened and died, in all places alike, and then there was the fourth group, those who fled. This option was available almost exclusively to the wealthy, the gente grassa, the fat people, the merchant and banking elite. As the plague took hold, they abandoned their magnificent urban palaces for the safety and clean air of their country villas in the hills of Fiesole and Setignano. This is the framing device for Boccaccio's Decameron, a group of 7 young women and 3 young men who retreat to a beautiful, well-stocked villa to wait out the plague, telling stories to pass the time. Their world is one of manicured gardens, elegant meals, and courtly diversions. It is an idyllic, artificially preserved bubble of the old world, deliberately contrasted with the hell they have left behind in the city. Their flight was a rational choice, but it was also a profound act of abandonment. They were the city's leaders, its patrons, its employers. By leaving, they took with them not just their persons, but the very concept of civic leadership and responsibility. They left the bulk of the population, the shopkeepers, the artisans, the laborers, the poor, trapped in a dying city with no resources, no leadership, and no hope of escape. For these masses, there was no strategy. There was only waiting. They were caught between the hedonism they could not afford, the asceticism that offered no guarantee, and the flight that was impossible. They died in their thousands, in their hovels and in the streets, their fate a testament to the brutal class divisions that the plague did not erase, but rather threw into the starkest possible relief. In the face of an enemy it could not see, comprehend, or fight, Florentine society turned to its healers. But the physicians of the 14th century, for all their learning and status, were men armed with archaic theories against a futuristic foe. Their struggle against the Black Death was not a battle, it was a rout, a tragic testament to the limits of human knowledge and the desperate, often grotesque, lengths to which the terrified will go in search of a cure. The medical establishment of the time was built upon the foundations laid by the ancient Greeks, primarily Hippocrates and, more importantly, Galen of Pergamon. Their system was one of elegant, internally consistent logic, but it was fundamentally wrong. They believed the human body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was the result of these humors being in perfect balance. Sickness was a state of imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one humor. The plague, therefore, was diagnosed as a radical imbalance, a corruption of the humors, often attributed to external causes. The leading theory was that of miasma, or bad air. It was believed that a poisonous vapor, released by earthquakes, planetary conjunctions, or the decomposition of organic matter, had traveled from the east and corrupted the very atmosphere. This corrupted air, when inhaled, would disrupt the body's humors and produce the pestilence. This theory, while incorrect, led to some of the plague's most iconic imagery. Physicians, in an act of self-preservation, developed a haunting uniform. They wore a long, waxed leather gown, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat. Most famously, they wore a mask with a long, bird-like beak. This beak was not for mere effect, it was a primitive respirator, stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and straw, juniper, ambergris, mint, camphor. The idea was to filter the miasmatic air, to breathe in a purified, good air while tending to the sick. The sight of a plague doctor, a slow-moving, black-clad figure with a monstrous avian face, became a symbol of the terror, a walking omen of death. The treatments derived from this humoral theory were, at best, useless and, at worst, actively harmful. The primary goal was to rebalance the humors. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was a common prescription. Believing the disease was an excess of corrupted blood, doctors would open a vein and drain a significant quantity of blood from the patient, a practice that only served to weaken the already ravaged body, often hastening death through shock and blood loss. Another approach was to draw the poison out of the body. This led to the direct treatment of the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes. Doctors would lance the gavaccioli with a knife, releasing a flood of bacteria-laden pus. This was excruciatingly painful and created an open wound highly susceptible to secondary infections. If lancing was deemed too risky, they would apply poultices designed to draw out the evil humor. These ranged from the benign, mixtures of clay, violets, and mallow root, to the truly disgusting. Some prescriptions called for plasters made from dried human excrement, or for live, plucked chickens to be held against the swellings until the bird itself died, supposedly having drawn the pestilence into its own body. Beyond these physical interventions, physicians offered a range of preventative advice. They recommended avoiding baths, as it was thought that open pores would allow the miasma to enter the body more easily. They prescribed complex diets, forbidding foods that were considered moist or quick to putrefy, like fish and most fruits. They advised people to stay indoors, to avoid excitement or fear, as this could agitate the humors, and to fill their homes with the smoke of aromatic woods. As the established physicians failed, and their death toll mounted alongside their patients, the field was thrown open to a horde of charlatans and quacks. With no regulatory body left to stop them, anyone could claim to have a cure. Empirics, barbers, and traveling mountebanks preyed on the desperation of the populace, selling worthless potions, magical amulets, and prayers for exorbitant prices. They promised secret remedies passed down from ancient sources or revealed in divine visions. This desperation fueled a market for the bizarre and the fraudulent, a grim sideshow to the main tragedy. The failure of the medical profession was total and absolute. It was a conceptual failure. They were like astronomers trying to fix a broken clock, their tools and their entire framework of understanding were for a different problem altogether. This powerlessness had a devastating effect on the morale of the city. The physicians, who along with the clergy represented the twin pillars of authority and knowledge, were exposed as utterly impotent. Their elaborate Latin terminology, their complex theories, their expensive remedies, all were swept away by the simple, brutal reality of the bacterium. The plague doctor, in his terrifying mask, became the enduring symbol of this failure, a figure of supposed knowledge and healing who could do little more than witness the dying and count the dead, his beaked mask a monument to the profound and fatal ignorance of his age. There comes a point in a great calamity when the mechanisms for processing it break down entirely. Language fails, rituals become hollow, and the sheer scale of death overwhelms the capacity of the living to respond. In the scorching summer of 1348, Florence reached this point. The city transformed from a place of living and commerce into a vast, silent necropolis, a landscape defined not by its magnificent architecture but by the overwhelming presence of its dead. The sheer number of corpses was the central, intractable problem. In the plague's terrifying crescendo, from April to September, it is estimated that Florence was losing between 400 and 600 people every single day. The city's population, which had been around 90,000 to 100,000, was being systematically erased. At first, the dead were buried with a semblance of tradition in the graveyards attached to the city's many churches. But these sacred grounds, hallowed for centuries, filled up with terrifying speed. The gravediggers, themselves dying at an alarming rate, could not keep up. Consecrated ground became a luxury the city could no longer afford. The solution was the mass grave, the carneo. Outside the city walls, in fields that had once been used for pasture or crops, massive, deep trenches were dug. The work of filling them fell to the bacchini, the corpse-bearers, who had become the undisputed masters of this new, dead city. Their rattling carts were the new pulse of Florence, their grim work the city's only functioning industry. The process was one of brutal, dehumanizing efficiency. The dead, often stiff with rigor mortis, were dragged from their homes and piled into the carts. There was no ceremony, no shroud, no final prayer. They were stacked like merchandise in a ship's hold, as one witness wrote. At the pits, the bodies were unceremoniously tipped in, a cascade of limbs and pale flesh. When a layer was complete, a thin scattering of soil was shoveled over it, and the process began again. Layer upon layer, the citizens of Florence, the wealthy banker and the poor weaver, the pious nun and the defiant sinner, the learned scholar and the innocent child, were buried together, their identities erased, their lives reduced to anonymous organic matter. The city itself became a tableau of death. The streets, once teeming with life, were eerily empty. The silence was profound, broken only by the rumble of the death carts, the distant wailing of a new victim, or the coarse shouts of the bacchini. The normal commerce of life ceased. Shops were boarded up, their owners dead or in hiding. The great workshops of the wool guild were silent, their looms gathering dust. The benches of the banking houses were empty. The only signs of life were the feral dogs and pigs that roamed the streets, sometimes feasting on the uncollected dead, spreading the disease further. The sensory experience of the city was a descent into hell. The air, once filled with the smells of baking bread and spices, was now thick with a miasma of a different kind, the sweet, cloying stench of decomposition. It seeped from the houses where the dead lay undiscovered. It wafted from the overfull carts. It rose from the mass graves outside the walls. It was an inescapable presence, a constant reminder of the decay that had consumed the city. Even the bells fell silent. At the beginning of the plague, the church bells had tolled constantly for the dead, a mournful, overlapping chorus that covered the city in a blanket of sound. But as the death toll mounted, the practice was abandoned. Some said it was because there was no one left to ring them. Others, more plausibly, said the authorities ordered them silenced because the constant, doleful sound was driving the few remaining survivors mad with despair. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was the silence of a void, the sound of a civilization that had lost its voice. For those who survived, huddled in their homes, the world was reduced to what they could see from their windows. They would watch the death carts make their rounds, counting the bodies, wondering which neighbor, which friend, had been taken now. They would watch the sky, hoping for a sign, a change in the weather, anything that might signal an end to the ordeal. The familiar landmarks of their city, Giotto's Tower, the dome of the baptistry, the formidable mass of the Palazzo Vecchio, now seemed like tombstones in a vast cemetery. They were monuments to a world that no longer existed, their beauty a cruel mockery of the ugliness that had consumed everything. Florence in the summer of 1348 was a city that had died but had not yet been buried. It was a ghost of itself, haunted by the memory of what it had been and the unspeakable reality of what it had become. The landscape of death was total, absolute, and for those who lived through it, it would be forever burned into their souls. All fevers, no matter how high they burn, must eventually break. The plague's dominion over Florence, absolute and terrifying as it was, could not last forever. The pestilence, in its furious consumption, had begun to exhaust its own fuel. As the summer of 1348 waned and the cooler, wetter days of autumn arrived, the tide of death began, almost imperceptibly, to ebb. There was no single moment of victory, no decisive battle won. The retreat of the plague was as mysterious as its arrival. Perhaps the cooling weather was less favorable to the fleas. Perhaps the most susceptible portion of the population had already perished, leaving behind a hardier, more resistant stock. Or perhaps the bacterium itself, in its relentless cycle, was simply entering a less virulent phase. Whatever the reason, the daily death toll, which had been in the high hundreds, began to drop. First to the low hundreds, then to dozens, then to a handful. The terrifying exponential curve of the infection flattened and then turned downward. The silence in the streets began to change. It was no longer the absolute, dead silence of a tomb. Now, it was a tentative, questioning silence. A shutter would creak open. A door would be unbarred. A pale, emaciated face would peer out, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight. The survivors began to emerge. They were the remnants of a great city, the flotsam left behind by a tidal wave. They walked through the familiar streets of a city now rendered utterly alien. It was their Florence, but it was a ghost town. Houses stood empty, their doors swinging open, their contents left as they were the moment the sickness struck. The workshops were silent, the markets barren. Weeds had begun to grow in the cracks of the paving stones in the great piazze. The city was populated by ghosts and memories. The survivors were a strange and motley collection. There were the wealthy who had successfully isolated themselves in their fortified palaces. There were the handful of ascetics whose gamble on piety and seclusion had, by chance, paid off. There were the few hedonists who had managed to drink and whore their way through the apocalypse and emerge, blinking, on the other side. And there were the ordinary people, the artisans and laborers who, through some combination of luck, genetic fortitude, or random chance, had been spared. They were all bound together by a shared, unspeakable trauma. They looked at each other with a mixture of relief, suspicion, and a profound, bottomless grief. Every person they saw was a reminder of the dozens they would never see again. The immediate aftermath was a legal and economic chaos. The plague had been the great equalizer, but it had also been the great randomizer of fortunes. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving vast estates and fortunes with no clear heir. Distant cousins, or even complete strangers with a tenuous claim, suddenly found themselves immensely wealthy. Conversely, the heads of great banking families had died, leaving their businesses in the hands of junior clerks or with no leadership at all. The very concept of inheritance, the bedrock of Florentine wealth transfer, was thrown into utter disarray. Notaries and lawyers who had survived were inundated with a flood of disputes and claims. A new, urgent problem quickly emerged: a massive labor shortage. With as much as 60% of the population gone, the value of labor skyrocketed. The surviving workers, the wool carters, the masons, the farmhands, found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. They could demand higher wages, better conditions. The old guild structures and wage controls, which had kept the working class in its place for centuries, were suddenly unenforceable. This seismic shift in the economic landscape would have profound and lasting consequences, planting the seeds of social unrest, like the Ciampi revolt a few decades later. But the most immediate emotion was a strange, almost manic energy. The survivors, having stared into the abyss and lived, were filled with a frenzied desire to live. Marriages, which had ceased entirely, boomed. The birth rate, in the years immediately following, soared. People spent their newfound inheritances with reckless abandon. There was a desperate, almost hysterical, return to life. But it was a life lived in the shadow of the mass graves. The joy was brittle, the laughter hollow. They had survived, but they were not unscathed. The plague had burned away the old world, and as they stood amidst the ashes, they faced the terrifying and uncertain task of building a new one. The disease had retreated, leaving a city that was empty, quiet, and forever changed. The fever had broken, but the patient, Florence, would be left with deep and permanent scars on its body and its soul. The Black Death was more than a demographic catastrophe, it was a psychological and philosophical earthquake. It did not just kill millions of people, it killed a world of certainty. The legacy of the plague in Florence, and across Europe, was not just one of loss, but of profound and radical transformation. The world that emerged from the shadow of the pestilence was a different world, one that would ultimately give birth to the Renaissance and the modern age. The most significant casualty was the unquestioned authority of the medieval church. For centuries, the church had provided the framework for every aspect of life. It was the source of truth, morality, and salvation. The plague shattered this foundation. The clergy had died in vast numbers, proving they had no special protection from God. The church's rituals, prayer, processions, relics, had proven utterly ineffective. The institution that promised to be the shepherd of humanity had been powerless to protect its flock from the wolves. This failure bred a deep-seated cynicism and a new kind of piety. For many, faith became more personal, more direct, a relationship between the individual and God that did not require the mediation of a corrupt or impotent institution. It fueled the fires of reformist movements that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation. At the same time, for others, the silence of God during the plague led to a turning away from the heavens and a new focus on the earth. If the afterlife was uncertain and divine justice capricious, then the tangible, knowable, human world became more important. This nascent humanism, this shift in focus from the divine to the human, was a core engine of the Renaissance. The economic and social order was similarly upended. The catastrophic loss of life radically altered the balance of power between labor and capital. With workers scarce, wages rose dramatically. Serfs and peasants, once tied to the land, found they could leave their lords and seek better pay elsewhere, hastening the collapse of the old manorial system. In Florence, the surviving artisans and laborers, empowered by the labor shortage, began to demand a greater say in the government. The Ciampi Revolt of 1378, an uprising of the city's disenfranchised wool workers, was a direct, albeit delayed, consequence of the social upheaval initiated by the plague. The old, rigid hierarchies had been shaken to their core. Wealth, too, was redistributed with brutal randomness. The vast fortunes left by plague victims, consolidated into the hands of a few survivors, created a new class of ultra-wealthy patrons. These families, like the Medici who would rise to prominence in the following century, were less constrained by old traditions and more willing to spend their immense fortunes on art, architecture, and scholarship that glorified not just God, but their city and themselves. This new patronage, fueled by plague-forged wealth, would directly fund the masterpieces of the Florentine Renaissance. The trauma of the plague was processed through art and culture. The art of the decades immediately following 1348 is often darker, more obsessed with death and judgment. The Triumph of Death, a popular motif, depicted skeletons harvesting souls from all walks of life, a stark reminder of the plague's indiscriminate fury. Yet, this darkness was also a catalyst. Literature saw the birth of Boccaccio's Decameron, a masterpiece of vernacular prose that, while framed by the plague, is ultimately a celebration of human ingenuity, love, and resilience. It is a profoundly humanistic work, born from the ashes of a world that had put its faith in the divine. The plague also spurred practical innovations. The experience of the pestilence led to the development of modern concepts of public health and quarantine. Cities like Venice and Ragusa established the first organized quarantine stations, lazarettos, where ships and travelers from infected areas were forced to wait for 40 days, 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine, before being allowed entry. It was the beginning of a rational, state-led approach to epidemic control. In Florence, the great project of the Duomo, the cathedral, stalled for a time, but its eventual completion became a symbol of the city's rebirth. When Brunelleschi, in the early 15th century, finally engineered the magnificent dome to crown the cathedral, it was more than an architectural feat, it was a statement. It declared that Florence had not only survived but had triumphed, reaching new heights of human genius. It was a defiant answer to the silence of God in 1348. The Black Death was the horrifying, agonizing end of the Middle Ages. It tore down a world built on faith, feudalism, and rigid hierarchy. But from that devastation, a new world was born. The survivors of Florence, walking through their quiet, empty city, could not have known it, but they were standing at a turning point in history. The pestilence had been a terrible, refining fire. It burned away the old structures, leaving a space in which new ideas, humanism, individualism, scientific inquiry, could finally take root and grow. The legacy of the plague, written in the stone of Florence and in the soul of Western civilization, is a somber testament to the fact that sometimes, the end of one world is the necessary, brutal precondition for the beginning of another.